Well, Deborah Ron Clemens poses the question that many people ask this day and age: why are most churches struggling financially? And she answers it saying there are two places we can place the blame. The first is on Jesus. Clemens goes on to remind the reader that Jesus has to be the one responsible for at least half of the church budgetary aches and pains. He clearly hasn't taken an economics class or a course on financial planning in his entire life, but he talks about money as if he is an expert on the subject. And he talks about it more than a lot of other things, which we often do our best to ignore. And yet, truth be told, even if he had taken an economics or a financial planning course, we all know it wasn't going to make much of a difference. None of his principles or his standards for stewardship would have changed. So the second place we can point is toward our own hesitation to follow the New Testament example of how to run our churches like the temple business. Jewish temple business was booming. The temple had no problem getting funding, even though the institution was massive, the property expansive, every detail lavish. And as Clemens points out, there were solid economic reasons for all of this. It was a monopoly. Jewish law allowed only one temple, one place to make sacrifices to the Lord, one place to house the Holy of Holies. So there was nowhere else to run off if you didn't like the way that things were going. Anybody who was anybody in Jewish society had to pay their temple tax, a fee required from every Jewish family, whether you used the services of the temple or not. Worshipped, didn't worship, only came once a quarter, only came at the end of the year, it didn't matter. Your temple tax was due. And then there were all the sales. Along the walls of the entire complex were hundreds of vendors, approved vendors, selling animals for sacrifice, approved grains for offerings, souvenirs like keychains or commemorative coins to be taken home after a pilgrimage. And then, of course, there was the infamous money exchange. And in addition to all of these profits, temple administrators took in fees for acting as trustees over widows' and orphans' estates. And the temple certainly benefited regularly from the underhanded, old boys club behind closed doors conversations and the donations that came with them that always ensured the unchallenged authority of those in leadership. So if we could just figure out how to make all of that happen, we'd never have to utter the word deficit again. We could set a price for the church's goods and services. We could administer as a pay-as-you-go sort of basis. We could charge $25 per person per worship service. We could require $10 extra if the sermon was extra good that day on your way out. $75 for counseling, $30 for a meal to be delivered if you're home and recovering from surgery, $45 for a pastoral visit that includes home communion, but $50 if you require gluten-free home communion. $20 per Sunday school class, $100 upfront fee to participate in the choir for the year. I mean, these are some bargain prices, y'all. It would work, except for Jesus. Or maybe we could hire a collection agency to go after those who are delinquent in their pledges. We could start a club for the biggest contributors, put their pictures in that showcase in the hallway, publicize the amount of their gift, rent out the country club each year for a private Christmas party just for them, smother them with special pastoral attention so they'd keep on giving. I mean, it would work. Except for Jesus. We could hold raffles, play bingo. We could hold spaghetti dinners every other week. We could charge $10 a person at the door. We could give door prizes at the end of the year for those who attended the most fellowship events. We could hoard large sums of money out of fear that tomorrow might be a rainy day. We could set a policy that we're not going to give any money away until we've paid for our expenses and closed any deficit. We could be such a booming success that we could send every member of the stewardship committee into permanent retirement and gift them each with an all-expense-paid trip to Hawaii because we may have 99 other problems, but money isn't one of them. But we'd still have to deal with Jesus. Jesus, if you recall, destroyed our plans for financial security and proved his lack of appreciation for the temple's economic well-being when he flew into the temple courtyard like a bat out of hell and flipped over the tables of the money changers, screaming, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." He can be so dramatic. And the thing is, though, his reaction isn't because he never took an economics class. It's not because he's ignorant to how the world works. It's because he's acutely aware of the question he answered just 10 verses back. A question we pondered a lot last week. What is the first, the most important commandment? The scribe asked. And Jesus replied, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus wanted his Father's house to be the place where all were treated equally, where everyone was welcome, where love for God and love for neighbor were held up as the highest of values. Jesus wanted his Father's house to be the place where the poor, the sick, the hungry, and the oppressed were the very first priority, where money was given in gratitude to God simply so God's name could continue to be praised to the ends of the earth. Clemens argues that Jesus' economic policies aren't the real reason that churches struggle financially. The real reason is our own perspective on giving and how easily we forget the call placed upon our lives. The temple had forgotten its primary purpose and call in the world. People leading the temple had forgotten their primary purpose and call in the world. So often we forget our primary purpose and call in the world. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus walked over and situated himself across the aisle from the temple treasury. And he watched people come and go, making contributions freely and faithfully. And the temple treasury is not where they would buy anything. This isn't where their tax was to be paid. There was nothing obligatory about this offering and no influence to be gained in giving it. These were anonymous gifts. And lots of people passed through, including the wealthy in their lavish robes, their gold jewelry, likely putting in very large sums of money. Again, anonymous, generous gifts. But Jesus kept on watching. And then a poor widow approached the treasury. Jesus would have known that she was poor and a widow from her attire. Because when it came to the socioeconomic class system of ancient Israel, widows and orphans were the lowest of the low. They had no means of supporting themselves and no one to care for them. And Jesus watched her intently. She pulled her hand from her pocket and dropped in 2 copper coins, the equivalent of a penny. And he said, "There, that's the one. That's the gift I have been waiting for. Now let's be clear, these 2 coins didn't stand a chance of doing much of anything. They were a drop in the bucket in the temple budget. They weren't going to pay for a salary or sponsor a new program. They certainly weren't going to close any budget deficit or even make a remotely meaningful contribution to the soup kitchen. Heck, those 2 coins couldn't even buy a light bulb for a Sunday school classroom. Her offering made no difference to anyone. The temple would function just fine without it. No one would miss her sacrifice. No one cared at all, except for Jesus. Jesus celebrated this offering. Jesus called his disciples together and he praised this offering not because of the amount that was given, but because of the heart that gave it. Truly, I tell you, this widow has put in more than all of those contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Jesus reminds his disciples that those who gave from their surplus were fairly unchanged by their act of giving. But she who gave from her need, she gave her life. Everything that she had, everything she could call her own in this world, she remembered that it wasn't hers to begin with. And she was acutely aware of the choice she was making, and it wasn't a choice for security or for savings or for herself. It was a choice for God. Her heart for God and for neighbor compelled her to give of what little she had, of all that she had. Her heart had been transformed by the love of God, and even if it meant losing her life, she wanted others to know the love and mercy and justice of God. A number of years ago, I was preparing to lead a youth mission trip to Guatemala. And it was fundraising season for our trip, and my mind was constantly on whatever fundraiser was coming up next. And I returned to my office after worship one Sunday, and outside my office sat this ripped-off portion of paper plate. And it was sitting outside my office, and it had 3 quarters stacked up on top of it. And on the paper plate, it says, "Dear Pastor Rachel, God needs this money more than I do. Please use it for the trip to Guatemala. Love, Philip." And for the next 5 weeks, every Sunday after church, I found 75 more cents outside my office door. Philip was 6 years old. Philip's offering was not going to pay for anyone's plane ticket. It wasn't going to cover the cost of a scholarship so someone could go who couldn't afford to pay. It wasn't going to make a dent in the supplies needed for the houses we would build. The trip was going to happen with or without Philip's $4.50. But I imagine Jesus would have called his disciples around to praise this offering. Not because of the amount that was given, but because of the heart that gave it. A heart that was far more concerned with loving God and neighbor than mine tends to be, at least when it comes to my money. My money. Friends, it is stewardship season. a season in the life of our church when we each consider how God is calling us to give of our financial resources for the mission and ministry of the church. But let me make one thing abundantly clear. God is far less concerned with the amount that you give than the heart with which you give. I'm going to say that again. God is far less concerned with the amount that you give than the heart with which you give. But I will warn you, when your heart begins to dwell more deeply in the love of God, when you allow Christ's call to dwell more deeply in your soul, the call to love God and neighbor with everything that you are and everything that you have, chances are you're going to feel called to give a little bit more than you thought you would. Because as a seminary professor reminded his students time and time again, when God gets a hold of you, you have to go to Staples and get yourself a whole new planner. And I imagine he'd also add, when God gets a hold of you, you got to go to the bank, get yourself a whole new checkbook. As we sit alongside Jesus and watch the faithful gift of this widow, we are reminded of the call that Christ places upon each of our lives to give the whole of our life for service in God's kingdom. But Jesus also calls the whole church to gather around and to witness this woman's faithfulness. For here is a woman willing to give of her life for the sake of the gospel. I couldn't help but think about a familiar charge given to the church. According to the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church, USA, the church is called to be a sign in the world and for the world. A sign that even amidst the darkness, God is present. Even amidst the terrors of this world, the kingdom of God is breaking in. And according to our church's constitution, the church will be this sign to the world if and only if it is giving of itself in every way. Healing and reconciling and binding up wounds, ministering to the needs of the poor, the sick, the lonely, and the powerless, engaging in the struggle to free people from sin, fear, oppression, hunger, and injustice, giving itself and its substance to the service of those who suffer, sharing with Christ in the establishing of his just, peaceable, and loving rule in the world. And this is the best part. The church is called to undertake this mission, even at the risk of losing its life. Even at the risk of losing its life. Hear, O Morrisville Presbyterian Church, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, even at the risk of losing your life. My friends, we have work here to do at Morrisville Presbyterian Church. I imagine you've got work to do on your own too, as I do, but we, Morrisville Presbyterian Church, we have monumental work to do in this community and in the world. And if you turn on any source of media today, you know how desperate that need is. It is my deepest hope that you will join us in that work. Jesus knew the work that lay ahead, which is perhaps why he pointed so confidently toward that widow and said, "See, this is the discipleship I'm talking about." For she gave everything she had. It seemed like a worthless gift to everyone else who witnessed it. But it was given with a purity of heart and a deep and abiding love for God and neighbor, even at the risk of her own life. It wasn't long after this teaching in the temple that Jesus too gave a pretty worthless gift. At least that's how it seemed on Friday when he hung dead on a cross. But God did pretty amazing things with that one. Amen.